Welcome, and I'm Pamela Forward, President and Executive Director of Whistleblowing Canada and co-chair of this conference, along with Professor Paloma Raggo from the School of Public Policy Administration at Carleton University. And the first panel today is called Civil Society Groups and Whistleblowing, and it will be moderated by Ian Bron. And I'm just going to take a minute to introduce Ian. Ian is an accountability advocate and a former whistleblower, having raised concerns about Transport Canada's oversight of marine security. His career has spanned a number of roles. He's been a naval officer, an educator, a federal government regulator, and a program evaluation team leader. And he'll be soon defending his PhD dissertation on whistleblowing. Whistleblowing in Westminster governments, actually. His long-term interests are to continue research into this field and to assist individuals, organizations, and governments develop speak-up cultures to prevent misconduct before it can cause serious damage. So Ian, I'll turn the proceedings over to you.
All right, thanks, Pam, and good morning, everybody. It's second day. I really enjoyed the first day, some great speakers, and we have a good panel here. We're going to be talking about NGOs, civil society groups, and whistleblowing. It's an issue that is relevant in every Westminster country that I've been in. These groups are now quite active in the field of whistleblowing as well. So we have 4 speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to be speaking. We'll be starting with Paloma. Paloma Raggo is an assistant professor of philanthropy and nonprofit leadership at the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. She's had a lot of roles and accomplishments, and she's a board member of the Association for Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Action, based in the US, and the Canadian Association for Nonprofit and Social Economy Research. And she has also been assisting Pam Ford in establishing Whistleblowing Canada, so in a sense, practicing what she teaches. Next, we'll have Cathy Barr, who is the Vice President at Imagine Canada, a national charitable organization. For the past 20 years, she has been involved in research and advocacy relating to the charitable and nonprofit sector. She also led the creation and development of Canada's first national standards program designed by and for charities and nonprofits. And third, we're going to have Joanna Gualtieri. Joanna is a whistleblower herself and a longtime advocate and activist in the whistleblowing sphere. She blew the whistle on the misuse of funds at foreign affairs in the early 1990s, and this triggered a decade-long legal battle with the government. And along the way, she founded Canada's first whistleblowing NGO, FAIR, the Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, spoke to and helped many whistleblowers, spoke at committees, helped draft legislation, and has served as a member and the chair of the board of GAP, the Government Accountability Project, which is in Washington, for those of you who don't know. And finally, we have Ian. Foxley is a retired lieutenant colonel, and I'd like to say a personal friend as well, and also a whistleblower and an advocate. He blew the whistle on corruption and Airbus contracts in Saudi Arabia, putting himself in real physical danger in the process. He was a co-founder and inaugural chairman of Whistleblowers UK, a whistleblower support interest group, and he is now the founder and CEO of Parrhesia, a whistleblowing think tank in the UK, focused on persuading UK policymakers to implement whistleblower protection. So, a great panel of experts, and I will start by turning over to Paloma.
Hi, everyone. So today, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to say today because there is much to say and only 12 minutes to do so. So in today's remark, I would like to talk about the relationship between civil society, its organizations, peoples, and whistleblowing. So these remarks are a product of researching the nonprofit and the philanthropic sector, its activists, the ways in which they help set the public agenda onto causes or issues we should care about. So I became interested in issues of accountability in civil society about 20 years ago when I was working in Brussels with the fair trade movement. I was there in an office with another person, the coordinator, and we were helping making policies and lobbying, if you want. Good people do advocacy, but we were lobbying the European Parliament to adopt fair trade standard. But even though I was making these big decisions and having a big impact, I had never met a single coffee producer that I was representing, and we were representing about 2 million of them. So I became interested in the issue of what happens if something goes wrong along the way, if we make decisions that are not okay, and who do I account to? Do I account to the donors that support our work? Do I account to the people I represent, or the policymaker who have the power to change things? Although I wasn't using the word whistleblowing in my research, that is, up until a student chased me down, convinced me that her topic was worth paying attention to, that I realized my research on leaders of international NGO and how they view the concept of accountability discussed some of the same fundamental themes linked to whistleblowing: principle, interests, and rules. Oh, by the way, that student was Pamela Forward. Little did I know I would continue to be inspired by her tenacity and passion to delve deeper in the world of whistleblowing in Canada. So as I mentioned, some of my previous research has looked at the accountability perception and practices of 152 executive leaders of international non-governmental organizations. I am curious about what is accountability for organizations and their leader who are at the mercy, they're not at the mercy of one of the most well-known accountability mechanism, democratic election. The question is, who elected them? Civil society has played an important role in speaking out on injustice and wrongdoing. There are simply too many examples. One can think of the backlash, for example, against Nike in the 1990s, when American labor activist Jeffrey Bellinger published a report on Nike's practice in Indonesia. He exposed below minimum wages, child labor, and appalling working conditions. Some of the academic literature used the term ideas entrepreneurs to explain why and where change occurs. Scholar argues that without someone or a group of people pushing for particular ideas, we wouldn't observe social change. In the Nike example, the idea was that humans, children, deserved better, and that consumers, those with the power to vote with their wallet, can make giants like Nike change their practices. In other circle, these idea entrepreneurs are what we call whistleblowers. So what is accountability in the context of civil society? Accountability, from the Latin computare, means to count, but to count what? And account for what? After interviewing over 152 executive leaders of NGOs, the answers clustered along 3 axes. First, accountability is about the principles, the ethical and moral values that an organization promises to uphold in their activities. Second, accountability is related to the interests of the powerful, often implying those with financial resources, and making sure that donors' interests are prioritized and respected. We might not agree with this definition, but that's implied. as a synonymous of accountability, many say just follow the money. Third, accountability is the respect of the laws, the norms, codes of conduct of organization that should or must adhere to. It is often in pursuit of accountability that whistleblowing, one of its first line of defense, is vital. By exposing wrongdoing, problems, injustices, individuals and organizations can aspire to learn and change their behavior. Without learning, there is no accountability, only sanctioning. People who expose issues often want more than disclosure, more than transparency. They want change and progress. For a long time, many civil society organizations saw themselves as the guardians of a just world, the keepers of the flame. But after the 1990s, they also increasingly were pressured to demonstrate their own accountability. The Economist famously paraphrased a Roman poet, "Who guards the guardians?" Civil society organizations weren't exempt and still aren't from criticism and atrocious behaviors. Abuses during humanitarian relief operations, misappropriation of funding happen. Recently here in Canada, and I won't necessarily name them because I don't want to be sued, but we have learned quite painfully how seemingly well-meaning charities can be engulfed in scandal and then tarnish and taint the reputation of an entire sector of activity. So whistleblowing within civil society is still something organization and its people must grapple with. We'll hear from Imagine Canada's effort in establishing standard and normalizing its practice within organization and how critical it is. However, we cannot negate the moral conundrum that some whistleblower within civil society face and why they might not always be as whistleblowing might not be as common within civil society organization. So think about this. It is not because organizations mean well that they necessarily do well. And when they don't do well, how should we react? If civil society organizations are vulnerable to donor support, isn't it more difficult to disclose wrongdoing? Who would later give to an organization that did something wrong? Is the wrongdoing and the consequence of whistleblowing worth the potential damage to the cause they serve, to the people they help? There is no clear answer, or at least I don't have a good answer to offer. What is important here is to remember that the act of whistleblowing is disclosing a problem. The organization and its people must take accountability for it. Accountability goes beyond responsibility. Responsibility meaning identifying who should take the blame. It is actually doing something about it and learning about it. And whistleblowers here are essential. While we tend to focus on individual whistleblowers, which is normal as they display courage and we admire these actions, they seek the truth. Whistleblowing can also be a collective movement, a social movement where we decry injustices here at home and abroad, where we vote with our wallets and ballots, where we offer the opportunity to learn and consider the costs that are shouldered by more marginalized people than us. So there is much to do to support whistleblower, but we must also remember the dual function of civil society organizations, decrying injustices, but also supporting whistleblower with the very limited resources they have. So these remarks were just meant to really highlight how civil society organizations are vital to the ecosystem of whistleblowing. We tend to focus, or maybe people tend to focus on the law, the formal mechanism of accountability, but there is much to learn about groups that self-regulate, groups collectively that are at the forefront of social change. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Paloma. And so next we'll go on to Cathy. Cathy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to share my screen here. Did that work? No.
Yeah, that worked.
Great. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel today. As Ian mentioned, I'm Vice President Research and Strategic Relationships at Imagine Canada. But prior to taking on that role, I spent a number of years working to establish Imagine Canada's standards program, which is the first standards program in Canada for charities and nonprofits, specifically for charities and nonprofits, that was developed by those organizations for those organizations. So I'm going to take you through a few things today, just a short presentation. I'll tell you a little bit about Imagine Canada, because I expect that it's not necessarily an organization many of you are familiar with, a little bit about our standards program, about the whistleblower standard, of course, which is why I'm here today, and a little bit about a small research project I did in regard to that whistleblower standard. So about Imagine Canada to begin with. Imagine, as Ian said at the beginning, is a national charitable organization, and our mission is to strengthen Canadian charities and nonprofits so we can better serve individuals and communities both in Canada and around the world. And that phrasing is conscious because, of course, there are charities and nonprofits that serve populations in Canada, but also ones that serve internationally. And so we do a number of things to fulfill our mission. One of them that we've been doing for many years is research on the charitable and nonprofit sector. We also do a lot of policy development and advocacy on behalf of charities and nonprofits, primarily directed at the federal government. We have, just to show you the breadth of what we do, we have a online fundraising tool called Grant Connect, which helps to connect charities, particularly in this case, registered charities, with foundation funding. We have a relatively new tool called HR Intervals, which helps organizations understand how to manage their people, who are the most important resource, ethically and effectively. And then, as of course, we have this standards program. So the standards program, as I said, was developed by and for charities and nonprofits. And important to note at this stage that we are 10 years post-launch and about 12 to 13 years from when we started working on it. So we've got a little bit of history now to, which in fact is what enabled me to do the research I did on whistleblowing. And there are 73 standards in the standards program. So it's important to understand these are very broad standards, and these 73 standards cover 5 different areas. Quite a large number of them are in the area of governance. So how charity boards and nonprofit boards of directors operate, how they manage the most senior staff person, and there is one, etc. There's a group of standards around financial accountability and transparency, fundraising, volunteer management, and staff management. The standards are they're used by thousands of organizations. There's only about 260 organizations that are currently accredited, that is, have gone through a full accreditation process and have been verified by Imagine Canada and our peer review panels who are drawn from the sector as meeting the standards. But we make the standards publicly available. This isn't always the case with accreditation programs, but we are very committed to, we aren't just an accreditation program, we are also a capacity building program. And we like to talk about the standards as best practice might be a bit reaching, but good practice. Because if you've ever been involved in standards, you have to walk a fine line between pushing organizations or businesses to do better, while not being too far out in front that no one that you're trying to reach can meet the standards. There are 3 levels to the standards. The charitable sector in Canada is very diverse. The majority of organizations are quite small, volunteer run, etc. There are some organizations that are enormous, thousands of staff, institutional, very, very large institutions. So we have 3 levels of standards defined by size, which to determine size, we use expenses, annual expenses, and a number of FTE staff, full-time equivalent staff. The whistleblower policy, and sorry, here's just an example of some of the organizations that are accredited. The full list is on Imagine Canada's website, which is just www.imaginecanada.ca. And the whistleblower standard has been there since the beginning. So it's one of the original standards. The standards have evolved a little bit over 10 years, but the whistleblower standard has been there from the beginning. It does apply only to level 3 organizations, which are organizations that have more than $10 million of expenses and more than 50 FTE staff. The standard has 3 components. The organization must have a policy that enables individuals to come forward with information on illegal practices or violations of organizational policies. The policy must specify that the organization will not retaliate against and will protect the confidentiality of individuals who make good faith reports. And the policy must be reviewed by the board every 3 years. So that is the standard, and that's what's publicly available if you went and looked online. That's what you must do. The second part is the evidence. So the evidence is what our peer reviewers look for to determine if the organization is meeting the standard. And so organizations that are seeking accreditation must submit a copy of their whistleblower policy, and the policy itself must include, or the application must include, the date the policy was last reviewed and approved by the board. And the review and approval of the board is important for the standards, not only the standard, but others, because what we have found over the years is that it's that regular review and approval that helps build the culture of meeting the standards and helps embed all these various standards within the organizational culture. So what did I do? I've only got a few minutes left to run through what I did. So what I did was I took a random sample of the policies that we have that have been submitted by level 3 organizations. So this represents roughly half of the policies we have on file, because there's about 100, a little more than 100 level 3 organizations are accredited. So I took a random sample of 50 whistleblower policies from that database, and I went through them and recorded key differences between them. Now, it's important to note I didn't look at whether they mentioned confidentiality or no retaliation, because that's required by the standard. So they all mentioned that. If they didn't mention that, they wouldn't have got accredited. So I looked at other things that could vary that we weren't specific about. So I looked at who the policy applies to, situations the policy applies to, who the allegations are to be reported to, whether anonymous reports are allowed, whether the policy includes a timeline for the investigation, and whether it provided for an appeals process. So just a quick overview. No, we're talking about 50 policies here, but it's more, I think, than we've had before in terms of the research. So in terms of who the policy applies to, in just under 50% of the cases, the policy applied to employees, volunteers, and/or board members. And that varied. Sometimes the policy said employees and volunteers. Sometimes it said employees and board members. Sometimes it said employees, volunteers, and board members. Board members are volunteers. So when it says employees and volunteers, that would include board members. 42%, it was employees, volunteers, board members, and others. And the others included things like students, stakeholders, sometimes was the term used, contractors, vendors, clients. There was a wide range depending on the type of organization. And then in 12% of the cases, the policy applied only to employees. In terms of situations, in 3/4 of the cases, the policies included a list of examples of who the policy, what situations the policy applied to. And there was a considerable variation here in terms of the detailed examples. Some policies had, 4 or 5 fairly broad type of examples. Others had a very detailed list. In 16% of the cases, there was a general statement that it applied to illegal or improper activity or wrongdoing without defining what that might mean. And in a shocking 8% of the cases, which we need to do something about, I think, it didn't say. So I think that suggested a flaw in our, maybe in our process where we need to specify that the policies do need to say something about the situations. In terms of who received the reports, this is who would receive the report from the whistleblower. In 3/4 of the cases, it was staff and/or board. In most cases, it was both were options. In 18% of the cases, it could be staff, board, or a third party. And in almost all cases, the position on the staff or the board was identified off the CEO, the board chair, those kind of things. In only 2% of the cases was reporting only to a third party. That is some sort of whistleblowing service, hotline, etc. And again, in evidence of a challenge we have in 4% of the cases, only 2 policies, it actually wasn't stated. So I think that's another flaw in some of these policies. It's not much help to have a whistleblower policy if you don't say who you have to report to.
Cathy,
Yep.
Cathy, you have 2 minutes left.
Perfect. I think I have 2 minutes more left to say. Can reports be submitted anonymously? In half of the cases, just over half of the cases, yes, they could be. In 15% of the cases, 8 policies, the policy stated that you could submit anonymously if you really, really, really wanted to, but they would not guarantee that your complaint would be acted upon. In 4% of the cases, again, just 2 policies, they specified you could not, it would not be allowed. There was no option to submit anonymously. And in 28% of the cases, they were simply silent on that point. Does the policy include a timeline for responding to the allegations? I thought this was particularly interesting. We didn't say in our standard what you had to do on that. And in about 1/3 of the cases, they provided a timeline, some sort of timeline. I was quite lenient in terms of how I counted that. In most cases, the timeline was just a commitment for the length of time in which they would acknowledge the report. Occasionally, it was a commitment to begin the investigation within a certain timeline. And only rarely, I think it was only 1 or 2 that I saw, was there a timeline to complete the investigation. And only 10% appeals seems to be the highest bar in terms of best practice on these policies that I looked at anyways. In only 10% did they provide or say anything about the opportunity for the person, the whistleblower, to lodge an appeal if they weren't happy with what they found. So that concludes my little research project into whistleblower policies in Canadian charities. And I need to stop sharing somehow here.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. It's interesting to see those numbers. They seem consistent with a lot of research into ethics codes as well, and the way people, organizations implement ethics codes, interestingly. But now we'll move on to Joanna. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian. I want to say first that I'm honored to share this time with you. And of course, thank you, Pam, Paloma, and Abby for not only your vision, but the sacrifice to make this conference a reality. For close to 30 years, I've been advocating for whistleblowers in Canada. I grew up in a family active in social causes, attending war protests when we lived in New York, civil rights marches, hunger sit-ins, and worker walkouts. My father was actually a professor at Carleton University in comparative religion and ethics. And in a Volkswagen camper, we traveled the world, witnessing extreme poverty, social injustice, and authoritarian regimes. So in many ways, I was primed for the issue of whistleblowing, but nothing prepared me for what was to come. My whistleblowing at Foreign Affairs, where I exposed billions of dollars wasted by the grand lifestyles of Canadian diplomats living abroad, changed everything. Their lavish ways, including their huge mansions, were financed on the backs of hardworking taxpayers. After 6 years blowing the whistle internally, I went public and sued the government, including Cabinet Minister Lloyd Axworthy, the Deputy Minister, and senior officials. This ensnared me in 13 years of litigation, with government lawyers asking me 10,579 questions in pretrial proceedings while incurring millions of dollars in legal fees. The government, of course, funded by you, the taxpayers, while I paid my own costs. And then suddenly it was quietly over when the government settled to avoid the media coverage of a 6-month trial. While the government simply moved on, I began the task of piecing together a life lost and focused on the cause. With 30 years of activism behind me, it is clear that whistleblower rights is one of the most profound socio-political issues for Canada, since without truth, we are doomed. Pam has asked me to talk about the role of mobilizing citizens around the issue of whistleblowing and the need for grassroots organizations. There is no doubt that only then will Canada move from a country at war with whistleblowers, which incidentally is the title of my speech, which I will give to Pam, but to one that truly values freedom of expression and tolerance for dissent. Canada needs to mature, and in so doing, enforce true accountability for those who commit wrong, while saying no more to the assault on whistleblowers whose sin is just believing that Canada has a place for truth. With urgency, we must take immediate steps to spotlight Canada's war on whistleblowers, but develop a proper understanding about why it is the duty of all of us, and not just individual whistleblowers, to commit to protection of truth tellers. Let us return to basics. Whistleblowing at its core is about telling the truth. Why then is it so controversial, since this ability is one that we are all born with? Why the need for special status and nomenclature, indeed even the word whistleblowing for something that is innate? This is a complex issue, but to simplify for today, the problem lay historically in the power imbalance between employers as masters and workers as servants. But this started to evolve decades ago, thanks to the US, when workers recognized that speaking truth to power was not only their right, but a public duty. In the 60s and 70s, we saw the emergence of conscientious dissent that shuttered dangerous nuclear plants, pulled dangerous drugs from market, and tossed out corrupt politicians. The pinnacle was when a young man named Daniel Ellsberg exposed government lies regarding the US's brutal war in Vietnam. His disclosures awoke the American public. truly awoke the public, and their resistance and outrage for the thousands of young men returning in body bags changed much. Public support was lost, and the government had to end the war. In '94, we of course remember the powerful impact of an anonymous whistleblower that forced the president of the US to resign in ignominy, exposed as a lying criminal. But the whistleblowing revolution was begun. The sheer socio-political magnitude of these seminal whistleblowing events led to a tendency to view whistleblowers as mythical and even heroic figures. Hollywood blockbuster movies perpetuated this, and recently Netflix released its series featuring our very own and really incomparable Tom Devine about the nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania. These movies portrayed whistleblowers as courageous and heroic, which they are, but the truth is that most whistleblowers are at their core something else. They are indeed you, they are us. They are just good people who, when they see wrong, seek to do right. They are workers simply doing their job. Engineers who sought to stop the launch of an unsafe space shuttle in 1986, but were ignored, resulting in the tragic death when the shuttle blew up and killed 6 astronauts. Doctors such as Dr. Nancy Oliveri, who you will hear from next, who in their dedication to patients seek to inform them of dangerous drugs, only to be muzzled, not Oliveri, of course, but she'll tell you about that, by giant pharmaceutical companies who hide behind secrecy agreements. Corporate executives such as the 3 women on Time Magazine's 2002 Persons of the Year, who sought to expose massive corporate fraud but were ignored, leading to the collapse of some of the world's richest corporations, devastating ordinary people in the process. What is clear is that whistleblowers are everywhere in every field. As Tom Devine pointed out, 47 countries have implemented whistleblower laws, but despite their breadth, they are bound by one common trait. They are true believers in democratic principles and the public's sacred right to know. Why then is this so controversial? The reason is simple. Institutions, be it government or industry, have an instinctive reflex to maintain their power. The ethos of the organization is to preserve harmony at all costs and to neutralize or even destroy anyone that threatens the status quo. Raising an alarm about organizational wrongdoing, for instance, a cabinet minister abusing public resources for theirself, a corporate boss rigging the books, a factory worker exposing toxins that are being released into the atmosphere, or a priest exposing the sexual abuse of vulnerable children, results in the whistleblower being immediately viewed as a threat who must be extinguished. In this sense, the idea that a lone whistleblower can effectively and safely challenge formidable institutions and persons is not really realistic. Even good whistleblower laws have failed to meet their promise because laws are only effective when they move from parchment to action, and this takes significant resources and expertise. In Canada, whistleblowers are given neither. This is why almost all are ultimately defeated and retreat, never recovering from the systematic bullying and targeted harassment. Peace and hope evaporate because in trying to save us all from harm, whistleblowers invariably combat evil and find nothing changes. It is an assault on one's faith in humanity, a realization that is lonely, lasting, and life-altering. I already mentioned the Netflix series on the nuclear catastrophe at 3 Mile Island. It profiles one of the plant workers, Rick Parks, who followed his conscience and spoke to the media about the nuclear breakdown when he realized that the corporate owners and government were doing what they so often do. They weren't transparent. That was 43 years ago, yet till this day, Rick has never recovered. Was he weak? To the contrary, he was powerful and resilient, but he is human, and the personal professional cost left a hole never filled. I urge you all to watch this series. For me, not a day goes by when I don't think about the losses in my life that occurred during 25 years of my life as a whistleblower. The death of my special needs brother, the death of my mother, the loss of a baby, the loss of all quality of life, and my disregard for my beloved husband, who never abandoned me and always believed in my purpose. I wish for even just a minute to be able to be attentive to my dying mother, and I long to go back to the magical years of early childhood of our two young sons, when instead of playing with them, I was locked in a 13-year war with the Canadian government, managing my boxes of files that, when stacked on top of each other, reached 5 stories high. With whistleblowing being so damaging and risky, we in Canada need to consider whether it is even moral to encourage whistleblowers, given that they are without protection. So what is to be done? Are we ultimately all powerless? Is the future one of quiet acquiescence and even complicity? The answer is no, because resignation would not only be dangerous, but it would ignore mankind highest calling, which is to be engaged, to care for the community, and to contribute to the well-being of all. And this is why the ultimate require going forward is to have an informed, engaged, and vigilant public. Every social, economic, and political movement, the civil rights movement, labor and gay rights movements, have succeeded by public engagement, where organizing and mobilizing citizens and the electorate was key for change. The same must be done for whistleblower rights. Here are some of the requirements for a framework going forward. No political leader should be supported, let alone elected, without producing clear evidence of a commitment and action plan to protect whistleblowers. The media, in its role as public journalists, has to develop a commitment to give voice to whistleblowers, not just the salacious details of the wrongdoing, but the struggle and impact on the whistleblower. The whistleblower has to be elevated to a position of reverence to protect them from the inevitable assaults on their character and professional and personal status. And the public has to become engaged. Without this, whistleblowing will never emerge as a legitimate force in Canada. 2 points need to be made. First, we the public benefit when the whistleblower blows the whistle on corruption. And second, Canada is a country of caring people. If someone else suffers, we all suffer. In this sense, then, it is immoral for us to be protected by whistleblowers and yet not take a role in protecting them. Public engagement begins with being alert to the issue. We must then move to champion the movement by becoming vocal advocates. Finally, whistleblower legitimacy in Canada will require well-funded, completely independent, legally savvy organizations whose full-time mission is to protect and advocate for whistleblowers. There are none. Canada's wealthy need to start giving back. Yes, supporting the arts and literature is important, but what could be more important than supporting fundamental principles of truth-telling? GAP would not have succeeded without the foundation money of America's elite, the Rockefellers, the Fords, Barbara Streisand, to name a few. Moreover, such organizations need the involvement of young, dynamic, energized young people. In my decades of speaking to universities, professional organizations, lawyers, accountants, churches, I learned that the public, and importantly, our youth, care. They support whistleblowers. We need now to establish organizations that are structured, funded, and have expertise. To date, whistleblowers have carried this burden in Canada. This is wrong. We need the broader public to become engaged. We need a peaceful yet loud revolution. Over 40 years ago, 2 young, fiercely dedicated, freshly minted lawyers named Louis Clark and Tom Devine joined forces for GAP. Today, it is the world's leading whistleblower organization. In closing, as painful and personally disruptive as it may be, we need to become more honest and take ownership of just how duplicitous Canada has been in its betrayal of whistleblowers. Every prime minister in recent history, Chrétien, Mulroney, Harper, Justin Trudeau, promised whistleblower protection. Each one proved dishonest. They all failed to implement protection. Never forget that whistleblowing involves two elements. First, the disclosure of the threatening wrongdoing, and second, the inevitable slaughter of the whistleblower. Protection involves both permitting the disclosure and safeguarding the whistleblower. If they are harmed, they must be vindicated and made whole, and the wrongdoer must be held fully accountable. At times, people need to be jailed. Merely stating that one is accountable, as our politicians and business elites so routinely do, means nothing. I want to end by telling you a brief story. I was 32 when I started to speak out about all the waste, essentially stealing of taxpayer money at foreign affairs. The war raged on for 2 decades. In the midst, I realized that I was on the verge of missing out on having the babies my husband and I so wanted. The stress had left me by the wayside, caused a miscarriage, and into my 40s, I was at high risk. And then a miracle. Zachary was born in 2003. 2 months after he was born, I was hauled into court when the Justice Department told the judge that I was stalling the proceedings by wanting just a few dozen weeks away from the legal proceedings to breastfeed my newborn son. I will never forget the day I sat in court stunned at this allegation from the very department that had stalled the legal proceedings for 6 years. It wasn't only the loneliness, but the knowledge that there was no humanity left. They don't kill you with arms, but instead destroy your spirit, destroy your person. This is the life of a whistleblower in Canada. Today, we must resolve to do better and never forget that we have the power to do better when we are united. Thank you so much for sharing this time, and to all who engaged. We will make progress, I'm sure of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That's a very moving story, and I couldn't agree more with your sentiments about the need for Canadians to start taking this seriously, as Pam has already said at the opening, in fact.
Thank you.
All right, our last panelist is Ian Foxley, CEO of Parrhesia. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to share the screen with you if I can. I hope that's up on screen. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me from across the water to join you all. And can I say, what a fantastic speech from Joanna. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for sharing your most personal aspects there. They parallel quite a lot of what everyone else has been through from the whistleblowing side. And I hope I can expand on that in a moment. What I'd like to do is talk to you about my experience and how I've tried to follow the same lead as a lot of whistleblowers, not to be a victim, but to actually gain something positive out of the experience. My journey started in 2010 when I was the program director for a very large £1.9 billion defense procurement program in Saudi Arabia on a contract between the UK government and the Saudi Arabian government, which involved a subsidiary GPT of Airbus Group. And we had a contract for the British government to be the prime contractor for the delivery of all the modernization of communications for the National Guard in Saudi Arabia. I was in the role for about 3 months before I started just finding things that were wrong. And this ended up within a 6-month period of me blowing the whistle, because I found payments to an offshore company in the Cayman Islands for 2 subcontractors that, as the program director, I knew nothing about. And when I started investigating them, I found that they gave no product or service to the contract, and therefore any payments to them were highly suspect. I had reasonable cause to suspect that they were corrupt. And in fact, in total payments, if they continued, they were 16% of the whole contract, which amounts to 260 million pounds going to offshore companies. For what? For nothing in return. They were bribes. It was corruption. So I blew the whistle. I got threatened with arrest and jail by my own managing director and by the HR director, who was a senior Saudi princess, a niece of the king, and a cousin of the commander of the National Guard. An arrest and jail on the say-so of the Saudi royal family in Riyadh is a death sentence. Believe it or not, it may take a bit of time to get you into the desert and bury you, but that's where you're going. So I got out overnight and blew the whistle to the Serious Fraud Office in London. And it then took 2 years to get the Serious Fraud Office to bring a formal criminal investigation. Because Airbus, of course, given the option of an internal investigation, hired an external, one of the big four, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to do an audit on themselves, who declared in 2012 there were no improper payments. It was a clean sheet. And then I pointed out to the SFO that Coopers, out in PwC, was Coopers Lybrand, who had been the auditors of this company 5 years beforehand. So were they likely to actually declare anything wrong? No. And he agreed and started an investigation. It then took another 3 years of prompting to UK Export Finance and to our business department, one of our own ministries, and a defence security organisation within that, to go and have a good hard look at Airbus and what else was going on. And that resulted eventually in 2016 in Airbus declaring, because if they hadn't, they were going to get seen to by the DOJ and the SFO, declaring findings of corruption within the company. And it then took another 4 years to get a deferred prosecution agreement on the first international cooperative DPA. And they were fined, and it took another year to get the original company that I blew the whistle on within Airbus fined. And last year, this is the one 2 years ago, resulted in the group, so we're talking about accountability at the highest level here, the group being fined 3.6 billion euro over 10 contracts. And then the judge noted that the criminality was not only global, but it was systemic. It extended throughout the whole of the business. And it wasn't just, when we look at Airbus in the whole, we can't just say, oh, they were good in declaring this corruption. Oh no, this had been going on for some time and was a global operation. And not only that, if you look within, and this came out in the detail of the DPA, the compliance department had actually been suborned by the sales and marketing department within Airbus. And they had formed a special group of 100 people within the sales and marketing organization with their own general counsel and their own compliance officers, whose sole purpose was to run corrupt structures and corrupt contracts and make sure that they had a paper covering of compliance and ethics, but actually fulfilled the purpose of the corrupt payments within each of those contracts. So this is egregious behavior from the highest level. And because Pedro Montoya, who was the group compliance director, actually sat on the board, you cannot say that the board at the highest level of Europe's largest defense manufacturer did not know what was going on. The company that I blew the whistle on took 10 years to actually admit guilt. They pleaded guilty to corruption last year and were fined 28 point, well, actually a total of 30.2 million, including the costs of the SFO investigation. The whole point about this, and I'll come on to the individual now, is that it's not that evil goes on. We know it goes on, but it takes people to stand up and do something about it. And those are led by the whistleblowers, those who sit in the middle of it and are brave enough to step forward and say something. and take the flak that comes at them for it. I'm not going to elaborate. I'm trying to draw the picture of the highest level of the group and then the company within it that I blew the whistle. I can't talk about the individual because the trial of the directors of that company is actually taking place at the moment. And this is timely because I've just come back from London yesterday, having given evidence in that trial for the past 3 days. And within it, to say that whistleblowers don't get protected, don't get off scot-free. I was put under examination, cross-examination in that trial, and that's fine. I don't mind that. But to be attacked for being the whistleblower, I think is outrageous. And to be attacked professionally and personally and then legally is actually the three assassins that come at you. But the last assassin is probably the most hurtful because there you stand in the witness box, not the dock, actually giving evidence of the illegality that you have found. And you are in public vilified for actually taking that stance. I think that's outrageous, I really do. But it's legal privilege, so on we go. I found that during this process, the first thing that you needed to do was actually set up an organization to support whistleblowers because there was nothing or nothing effective when I needed it. And therefore we set up with the help of another, in fact, there were 12 whistleblowers, this is in 2012, who were gathered together because we'd all been through the same experience. And what we set up was an organization to provide 3 things. The first thing is therapeutic counseling, because you need somebody to listen to you. Emotionally and spiritually, you need to know that you're not on your own. You need to know that there are people out there who understand, who have been there, done that, and are willing to be that, if you like, in baseball terms, I'm British, but I'll put it in baseball terms for you, to be that first capture, the person who responds and says, yes, I've got you. I will stand with you and I will understand what you're going through. And I will point you at the other 2 elements that you are going to desperately need. And the first is legal advice from good, trusted lawyers who understand the battle that you're going to have to fight. And secondly, media support, because the media are one of the very few ways that you can rebalance the equation between the power, might, and resources of the organization and you, the individual. And it's only through being put in contact with trusted members of the media that you can actually fight the marketing and PR departments of large public and private organizations. I did that for 3 years as the inaugural chairman. And then I found that really what you need to do is you need to change the law. But to change the law and the culture, you've actually got to influence the government. You've got to influence policymakers, but you've actually got to get into the heart of government, those in power. But politicians only come up with the bright ideas and sell that to their voters. Where do they actually get the policy? The policy comes from the policymakers, that raft of professional civil servants and think tankers who produce the ideas and shape it for them. And they rely on experts. They rely on people well-versed in the research and the study and the lived experience to provide them with the knowledge, not only of what is missing in the law, but how it can be rectified. And to do that, you have to go to the lived experience, people like us, the whistleblowers, to represent what happened and what was missing. And those who spend their life studying it, the academics who specialize in whistleblowing experience or whistleblowing law. And that led me to the idea that perhaps you go back to college. And so I did. I went off and I did a master's in applied human rights, looking at whistleblowing as, to me, the most fundamental of human rights, because without whistleblowing, without the ability to speak truth to power, you will not get your other human rights, because you cannot tell the truth about what is going wrong. and the abuse that people come under. And that wasn't good enough. So I went on and did I'm just coming to the end of my PhD. And this is where I met Ian about 18 months ago, when we did a bit of collective brainstorming about whistleblowing in government. And I'm looking at what's now called a political socialization of whistleblowing, looking at the case study where I blew the whistle and asking those around me why they did not blow the whistle, because it's a very difficult topic to answer, to research. You can only research if you do it from the insider point of view, because you know who should have blown the whistle, you know if they could have blown the whistle, and you know where they are in the chain of command, in my case, right up to the Prime Minister's office. And I've now interviewed about 42 people in that chain, and I can now say, this is just an example of some of the things that they said to me, of the range of, I think it's about 26 different excuses that I've catalogued and coded, why they did not blow the whistle or felt that they could not blow the whistle, to actually analyze that down to 5 root causes. And I put these to you, and this is the basis of my thesis, that the 5 root causes of individual silence are firstly and primarily fear. People are scared. People are scared for their livelihood, their profession, their career. They're scared for their health because it affects you both mentally and physically. They're scared for their family and the effect that it has on them. And secondly, there's a perception of ineffectiveness. I'm only an individual, but you're a very big organization. You're a government. You're a government department. How can I compete? And I'm just going to get squashed in the whole battle between us, and you're going to ruin my life and my reputation. You're too big and I'm too small. And therefore, I'm not going to blow the whistle because you're just going to crush me. The third belief is a belief of complicity. You've made me feel that I am complicit to the crime, or I'm perhaps criminal myself. And therefore, like the boiling frog, you've dipped me in a little bit and you've turned up the heat bit by bit until you convince me that I am complicit and therefore I'm not going to blow the whistle on you. The fourth area is what I call the grey zone. And this is where your civil servant comes in. He doesn't blow the whistle because he knows how dangerous it is, but he leaks it, or he finds a way of obstructing the wrongdoing going forward. He pours sand in the petrol tank or sugar into the works. And the last one is below the line. This is the political one. This is the politician saying that for the greater good, for the greater strategic or political or economic need, we have to do this dirty hands business. We have to pay the bribe because otherwise we won't get the business, or the French or the Germans or the Canadians will. And therefore we will be wrong, but it's excusable. We can go forward. It's a consequentialist view. And therefore I don't speak up because I believe in it. And those are the 5 main reasons. But the end effect of those main reasons is that they produce individual silence. And when individuals all gather together, we get organizational silence. And when organizations gather together, we get a culture of silence. And the problem of the culture of silence is that we then get a feedback loop. And that becomes a social and cultural pre-programming of people coming into organizations who are induced and inducted and then onboarded within the organization not to speak up about the wrongdoing. And that means that we have a vicious circle, which means it just continues.
Ian, you have about 2 minutes to wrap up.
2 minutes? Ideal. I came across this idea. It actually originates in Euripides' play The Bacchae, where the king guarantees protection to the herdsman because he recognizes that the herdsman has vital information that he needs to know about. And it's called Parrhesia, the idea of speaking freely because you are guaranteed protection if you do. And this is an idea that we have forgotten. It was taught to Greek citizens, and over the centuries, we've forgotten it. We've lost it. And we need that idea to be returned into public life. And that's what we're setting about doing. And I've set up Parrhesia because I've gathered in the experts, the academic council from all the experts in UK and a few from abroad, thank you, Pamela, who become the advisors on what is needed and what is going wrong and how it can be rectified. We marry that off against a policy advisory group who knows what needs to be done, and we take it to the policymakers and government. And what we're trying to do is revitalize the idea of this parrhesiastic contract as a social contract between organizations and individuals, whether they're public or whether they're private. And it marries from the very top of the organization down to the individual worker within that organization. And effectively, it tries to break the cycle of culture, the cycle of the culture of silence. And to bring you right up to date, this was the launch of the Economic Crime Manifesto, which is what we're trying to put together with the APPG on fair business banking and anti-corruption and tax reform in this country, to actually put into a bill which is currently going through Parliament as part of the fight against Putin and the oligarchs and the corrupt autocrats, to actually empower people to bring greater transparency, greater enforcement and greater regulation, and most importantly, look at item number 3, protection for whistleblowers. Because if you don't protect the source of your intelligence on where things are going wrong, you will have no intelligence going forward. And with that, I'll leave you with it for questions and answers. I think I've hit my time out.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, that's very interesting, and I've always liked the UK concept of the all-party parliamentary group, the APPG. It's something I think we need here in Canada, a parliamentary group that focuses on accountability and whistleblowing, and that includes a wide range of stakeholders, not just the usual parliamentary insiders. All right, well, thanks. That's a great panel of speakers, and I noticed that the speakers spoke from 3 perspectives. We had Paloma and Cathy speaking about NGOs and accountability within those NGOs. And Joanna and Ian were talking about their personal experiences as whistleblowers and how that translates into both a call to action and a need for NGOs to step up and support whistleblowers in the wild, as it were, because of course there's not a whole lot of official support. If anything, it's the opposite. And so we'll go over to questions now, and I think we'll start with the questions that are in the Q&A, because those are the most immediate ones, but I have some of my own as well. So why don't we start with the question to you, Cathy, about why are whistleblowing policy requirements limited to the larger organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's frankly the answer is not going to be particularly satisfactory to this group. I know. As I mentioned in my talk, the nonprofit sector in Canada is extraordinarily diverse. So we have a very large number of organizations that they have no staff at all. They're entirely volunteer run. They have very, maybe budgets of a few $1,000s, all the way up to very large institutions. In Canada, all our hospitals and universities are registered charities, for example, and very large cultural institutions, etc. So the standards were designed by a fairly large group of, there were probably about 200 individuals from various organizations involved in the creation of the standards and the standards program. And there was a lot of concern about making sure that the standards were achievable for all different types of organizations. So that's why the 3 levels were created in the first place. And then once we created the 3 levels, an interesting thing that started to happen, which was that just as the the question is, shouldn't all organizations be required to have a whistleblower policy? A similar argument was made about a very high percentage of the standards. So once we actually got into practice of saying who should do what, there was a lot of sense of, well, everyone should do this. And in fact, I think it would be quite easy to argue that all organizations should be meeting all 73 standards. But nevertheless, we wanted to take capacity into consideration, and also to some extent, I guess, the potential for harm. And although, of course, small organizations can be involved in wrongdoing, the scope of it, certainly the impact on the individual would be the same, but the scope in terms of the number of people that might be affected, or the resources that might be being wrongfully disposed of, it would be less, right? So that was kind of how a group of people came to the conclusion that this policy should only apply to the largest organizations. But we do, we look at these questions all the time. We take feedback on them, and we review the standards constantly. At one point, there's a standard around diversity, equity, and inclusion. At one point, that policy only applied to the largest organizations, and now it applies to all organizations. So, the standards do evolve, and this could be a policy that does change. So, I guess that's the best answer I can provide, and I know it's probably not satisfactory to particularly people who've been involved in whistleblowing, which is obviously a high stakes endeavor.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. The next question is for you, Paloma. Is there a specific factor that you look for to delineate between organizations that are, in effect, I guess, producing policies or implementing policies more as a blame mechanism versus actually trying to have an accountability framework?
It's a good question that is very challenging to answer, in the sense where it would be a great research question to understand the factor that leads some organizations to have reprisal behaviors or more sanctioning behaviors, where others have more learning behaviors. So, from a research point of view, that would be really interesting. But what I can tell you with my research on this idea of accountability, when I did that project, people were asked, how do you define accountability? And that's where the question was open-ended. That's where people answered. And then after, I was curious in understanding, how does the context in which leaders of these organizations work shape, or do they have a different view of what accountability should be, what their world is? And what I found was there are interesting association. Saying causes would be a bit too definitive, because more research is done, but one of which is resources, access to resources. Interestingly, people tend to, so when we interviewed people, most of them answered, we're accountable for the money, that is entrusted in us, and if we deliver on the promises we make. But if you delve deeper into the responses and the ways in which people responded, it was really interesting to find that larger organizations that have more capacity, are much more nuanced in the way sometimes they can appreciate and understand accountability. So accountability both to their donors, but also their recipients and the people they provide services. Smaller organization, it's not that they're not accountable, it's just that in organizations, sometimes there are priorities and there are some constraints that you have to keep in mind in order to survive as an organization, because they do depend from donors and funding. And so these tend to focus much more on financial mechanism or things that are easily measurable. So it's a challenge. And I think many have argued, and Joanna said it very well, that we need to think collectively as our responsibility and support organizations that try to implement broader accountability framework.
All right, thank you. Joanna, you have indicated you'd like to answer this question about the Human Rights Act and how it should apply to whistleblowers.
So I think the point can be most simply answered by, let's remind ourselves, after World War II, we signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 48, and we said never again. And today we have people being blown to smithereens in the Ukraine, in Yemen, in Syria. And so these statements on paper, indeed, even Canada's Constitution and Charter of Rights, which we celebrate and which we have, told the world is one of the most profound documents with the fundamental freedoms granted therein, they are written on paper. And what happens in real life is quite distinct from the enumeration of rights given, as I said, on parchment. So in Canada, I find this a particularly troublesome issue because we don't have a history like the US of individual, challenge of the power structures in the government. And so we have been very trusting, and we have been very proud of our, what we've declared on paper, human rights, tolerance, but we have a very poor track record of practicing that when it comes to whistleblowers. And I don't need to state again, many people have done it. Tom Devine made clear that we have the worst record in the world. So though the Human Rights Act gives us comfort when we read it, it does not protect us when we're out there in the real world as whistleblowers.
Yes, that's an unfortunate truth. It hasn't really protected many that I've seen. All right, so moving on to some questions for Ian. And Ian, there's a few questions for you. Some pertaining to your case. For example, were there any charges brought against PricewaterhouseCoopers for issuing a clean audit when it clearly wasn't?
No. Just a very quick answer to that one. No, they really merely just earned the disdain of the public in general when GPT then declared themselves guilty 10 years later. And of course, at the group level, they were found to have, they only had 10 specimen cases. There were more of global corruption on behalf of Airbus. And even more laughable was the other organization, Ethics Intelligence, who came in and did a compliance check on group processes within Airbus and gave them a clean bill of health and a certificate. So don't go near either of those two organizations in future.
And there's another question as well, asking whether you were involved in the entire 12 years through the process, or did you step back at any point?
I stepped in the whole way. I never let it go. Now that's not because I'm a Rottweiler, or it's because I hated the injustice and the idea that the might of a very big defense manufacturer with the backing of a couple of governments would actually bury it. They'd kick it into the long grass in the hope that I would go away and leave it. And the answer is no. I'm a rugby playing paratrooper, and there is no way I'm going to let them off. And so I've seen them through the whole process, even to the point, and I'm not joking, in 2016, the Serious Fraud Office had completed their case, recommended a prosecution to the Attorney General, and he sat on it for 3 years. And the only way we got him to move was because a very good bunch of lawyers in London backed me. And we wrote to him and said, we are now going to take a case against you, the Attorney General, at the Supreme Court to explain why you are still holding on this case for 3 years. And it was just after he'd prorogued Parliament and they'd been seen off by the High Court, and they didn't want another case the following week, I don't think. So yeah, then it went to prosecution, but it took a long time.
I think that most of these organizations are a little surprised when whistleblowers don't give up. Maybe it's because they're used to people backing off with a bit of pressure. So yeah, it's good that you stuck it through, because
I'd like to add one other thing, that whistleblowers, you are a victim, or you're made into a victim, but you don't have to let victimhood govern your life. You can fight, you can win. And what I'm determined to do out of this case, and I said this in court last week, is that I want to be an example to other whistleblowers that you can win. You can be vindicated publicly, and you can bring the wrongdoers to justice. We need more good examples of where whistleblowers have actually won in the end and been vindicated.
That's a good message, and one I think that Joanna agrees with, although the victory can come at a personal cost. Joanna, you indicated you wanted to answer the question about the need for an international organization to protect and assist whistleblowers, though I think it's also a question that other people may want to speak to. So we'll start with you, but if anybody else wants to contribute to that question, go ahead.
So just briefly, the idea of an international organization is a very it's one that we would all like to aspire to, that somehow in a global community we can commit to some universal principles. But I think whistleblowing has to be managed at a more local level. I don't think that, right now international organizations are under assault. Countries are withdrawing and more balkanized. And so, but also from a practical perspective, you need to have support at a local level. I think there is real strength in people that are in your immediate community. And they are the ones, organizations started having real problems of accountability when they became more global and more diffused. When organizations were smaller, when you knew who was working in the office next to you, there was this different personal perspective on things. So yes, organizations at an international level certainly can exist, but I think that you're going to find real power locally.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, please.
I agree wholeheartedly, but I don't think we need an international organization. What we do need is exactly what we're doing today. We need people like Pamela and yourselves in Canada to interact with people like me in the UK, and with Tom Devine in New York, and with PPLAAF in Africa, to ensure that the principles that we're all arguing are reiterated time and time again, because they're the same principles across the world. We learn off one another, and we if you have a bright idea, then bring it to us. If we have a bright idea, we bring it to you. This idea, go and look please at the Economic Crime Manifesto and the what's going forward there, and that I think is probably a better way of taking it forward.
If I can add, sorry, just to add, I study international organizations, or I guess I did for a while, and that's where we should be reminded the role of civil society and coordination. And I think Ian was exactly right that we need to find ways to support that international coordination. Through academic networks, through civil society networks, and maybe think of a way collectively to support that, because there are some transfers of resources that sometimes are possible, whether it's with knowledge or, you know, funding or ways in which people can collaborate. I would be hard pressed to see governments wanting to fund organizations that will help blow the whistle on them. And so, you know, I think civil society here becomes really central to this idea of internationalization of whistleblowing practices and united, creating a common front.
Right, and Pam, you wanted to contribute as well?
To ask Ian if he wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about the all-party parliamentary groups. I think they're, from what I know about them, which is very little, they're fascinating. And from what I understand, they are an integral part of how your parliaments work, where all parties come together and work with civil or nonprofits or civil society organizations on various issues. Could you tell us a bit more, Ian, about how
certainly.
that?
The all-party parliamentary group is actually, I mean, it takes an idea, it takes a topic, and it gathers together membership from every single party. Well, they're all invited, whether they come or not is a different matter, but those members who have an interest in that topic to actually discuss an issue which is relevant without party political bias. And what they try and do is gather a consensus of opinion and also investigate issues and delve into possible solutions, and then put together a paper and try to find a member of that group who is willing to sponsor a bill. Now, ideally, you will have a member of the government or a member of the front benches who actually will be part of that APPG and who will then lead on that topic, supported by the APPG, in pushing through a bill through Parliament to put in effective measures. That's how it works. They seem to be a very good forum for discussion of topics in the formulation of legislation. And they necessarily then interact with civil society, the different NGOs, and also with the academic world, because that's, remember my little diagram on how we get policy together and how we go back to the academic experts and those with lived experience, because sometimes it's more the human message that is important than the depth of dry academic study. And I say that in the middle of dry academic study myself, so I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. And it sounds like something that we badly need here, because when civil society groups, you know, converse or try to communicate quite often with our elected representatives, they're silent. We don't get a response. For example, we invited the minister responsible for the federal law to participate in our policy forum today. Officially, with an official letter from Whistleblowing Canada and from Professor Raggo, and there was absolutely silence in terms of a response.
That's a great shame. The last slide I showed you with the APPG there, we actually had at that evening, we had Dame Margaret Hodge, who's the chair of the APPG on anti-corruption and tax reform, with Kevin, who's a Labour, a very long-standing, and she was chair of the Public Accounts Committee and a very, very respected chair of that select committee, along with Kevin Hollinrake, who's the chair of the Fair Business Banking Group, and Damien Hines, who's the security minister, who's responsible. He's one of the sponsors for the forthcoming economic crime bill. And we had Lord Acklam, who, if you look him up, was very famous for resigning as a front bench member from the House of Lords on economic crime, and was actually the reason that the Economic Crime Bill Part 1 got initiated, which effectively brought in a whole load of sanctions and greater measures against Putin and his oligarchs. So it's a powerful body, and it's a very, very influential body. It can't make law, but it can certainly influence it.
Right, and they're not afraid to interact with their people with lived experience,
Not at all. They're quite happy to invite and consult and ask for contributions from the people with lived experience so that they can formulate the policy properly.
Thank you.
Well, that is a very refreshing attitude. We don't get much of that here in Canada, unfortunately. But,
well, if you invite me to come across, I'll come across and talk about it with you.
Well, hopefully that can happen sooner rather than later. We'll see. So I apologize, but we've run out of time. We have easily enough questions to go for another half hour, and there are a line of comments in the comments, which some of which are implied questions. All I can suggest is that people go into one of the chat rooms to discuss. Other than that, I have to thank the panelists. This has been another amazing, engaging discussion with a strong panel. So it's, Pam, I have to say I've been very impressed with the speakers so far. It's been really wonderful. So thank you, everybody. Paloma, Ian, Joanna, Cathy, and we'll see people at the next session.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Lovely to be with you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.